So the big goal today is we want to kind of review some of the navigation bits that we've talked about already, but we also want to talk about some additional controls and pathways that you can use to facilitate that navigation. And one big thing that we're going to talk about for sure today is how to deal with fragments, because that's one important part for a few of these controls to make them work. Specifically the tabs, really you do have to use fragments to make them work. You can make a drawer work without fragments. There is some value to having a fragment there. But the example that they kind of have, if you just generate a drawer project, does already have fragments in it. So first we want to talk about back navigation. Just review on that real quick. We'll talk about hierarchical navigation specifically. We talk about up and descendant, so ascendant and descendant. And then we'll talk about the navigation drawer, and we'll also talk about doing what we call lateral navigation with tabs. Okay. So first kind of way that you can go through your app is you can go back, right? You can hit the back arrow and you can go back to a previous screen. Okay. For the most part, that's just built in, right? We send an intent to go to the next screen, and then the user just pushes the back arrow and it goes back to the previous screen. So for the most part, as long as we're using every activity is kind of, or every screen that they see is a separate activity, we don't really need to do too much with that, right? The backstack kind of deals with that. However, especially if you get into working with fragments or things like where you're not actually replacing, you're not actually going to a different screen, sometimes we need to customize how that back button works a little bit. Okay? You think kind of a browser where, hey, you click on a link, it goes to the next page. Well, you're not really opening a new screen. So you would expect that back button to still take you back to the previous page, not to the previous screen, if that makes sense. So we kind of change what the back button means sometimes. Up navigation is also kind of important. That's again where we put the arrow up on the top left. Usually back navigation and up navigation will be pretty close as far as where they send you. Ideally, they will both send you the same place, but that's not guaranteed. Okay, so the way we set that one up, remember we have to tell each activity what their parent is in the manifest. So one thing to think about as we're kind of working through this is you really want to think about how does the user go through your app? What kind of screens are they going to visit as they use your app? So if you're thinking about, say, a website, right? A common tool that we use with websites is to create sitemaps, right? We make a sitemap that says the user can go from this page to that page to the other page. How can they get there? You know, what pathways are valid? We can often do the same thing with an Android app, and it can be very worth the time to kind of do that and look at what are those pathways to get to a particular piece of functionality, and maybe can that be better, or what are some of the downsides with that. Okay, so if we think about, I think they have yeah. So if we think about kind of an overlay of this example app, this theoretical app, we say, hey, we've got this news application, right? So up at the top, we have the app, right? And you kind of think of this as the first screen that users going to see, right? So we say, okay, first of all, they're going to come to the first screen. Now the first screen is going to say, do you want to go to top stories, tech news, or cooking? Right? You can go to any of those sections. That make sense? And maybe the easiest way to set that up is to just say, well, here's 3 buttons. Right? Here's a button to top stories, tech news, cooking. It could just be as simple as that. Could just be 3 buttons, each of you take you to another screen. Right? When we get to that other screen, well, what's on that screen? Well, there's probably going to be a list of articles, right? Again, because this is a news app. So I get one list of articles if I go to top stories, I get another for tech news, I get another for cooking. So far so good, right? So I've got basically 4 screens already in the app. Now, anytime I go to one of those screens, they're going to have a list of articles, right? Or a list of headlines, right? So I want to click, when I click on one of those headlines, I want to then go be able to read the full article or story, right? So then I may have other screens that the user can get to from there. Does that make sense? So every article that they click on here is potentially a different screen. Now, in reality, we probably don't want to say, okay, well, there's 4 headlines here, so let's make 12 pages there, right? We probably don't want to make 12 screens for, a screen for each headline, right? So we would make one activity probably that's going to work with any particular article. That make sense?
So would you reuse like the story like as one activity?
Right.
If you want.
Well, I would represent it as one activity. I'd represent it with a single layout. Right? I'd say all my stories, regardless of what they're for, roughly are going to have the same layout. Right? So I might have a header and then body text, place for videos, yada yada. But they're all going to have relatively the same format, so I'm going to use the same activity here. Right? Okay, so that reduces, so I can use the same activity for every story, for every article, but I still have these lists up here. Well, are all these 3 pages, don't they look very similar? Right? Don't they look really similar? So in an app like this, maybe that's just one activity, right? Maybe that's just, I give it a different extra in the intent when I click that button, right? So this may be in reality one activity representing each of these 3 things, right? So because really it's just a title and a list of articles, right? So I need to create 3 separate activities for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the way this factors out, well then I really only need I need 3 activities. Basically to make this thing work, I need 3 activities. Okay. Now, I could keep those as activities, right? Remember I mentioned yesterday, we talked briefly about fragments, right? Fragments are sort of a mini activity. So these don't actually necessarily have to be activities. Anywhere here we have an activity, we could really maybe make it a fragment, right? So rather than the story necessarily having to be a separate screen, maybe it's just a fragment, right? Maybe the story is just a fragment. And maybe this here in the middle, maybe that's also just a fragment, right? Because it really doesn't have to necessarily be a whole screen, right? So I could start with the workflow of the first screen's got 3 buttons, I go to the next, it's a list, and the next one, it's a set of, it's the actual story. But the other way I could think about this, if I change those up to be fragments instead of full-blown activities, maybe on a tablet, we kind of talked about this yesterday. What if on a tablet, I cut it down the middle, and I say over here on the right side, we've got the story, okay? And on the left side, I've got a place to pick an article, right? And so that could be one of those 3 lists. Well, let's just take up the minimum space. So let's say make those tabs. Top, tech, just trying to save space on the whiteboard. So I could do all of that kind of in one screen, right? If I rearrange it. And if I think about those things as fragments, instead of thinking about them as activities. Does that make sense? So there are ways to rearrange it if we build these screens as fragments instead of building them as full-blown activities. So that's one of the things that we want to talk about is what are some of those tools that we can use to put multiple things on the same screen. And that's a big part of the new stuff that I want you to get out of today is how to put a lot of these things into one screen instead of having them be 3 separate screens.
Can you think of like a fragment as like a partial, or is that?
Yeah, that's a good approximation. A partial and a fragment are basically the same thing. A partial view and a fragment. Okay. So going back and kind of thinking about our navigation, so you saw how we kind of got that map of how we get from page to page to page, right? So the first thing we have for navigation is we can do back navigation. We refer to that as temporal navigation because we're kind of going back in time. So we keep track of all the screens that you've gone to. Say you start at the launcher, which would be the the home screen. You launch your app, and you go to the second screen, and there's another screen from there, right? And when you hit back, you want to go back in. Does that make sense? The whole goal of back, as far as the user is concerned, is they want to go back to where they were previously in time. Okay. So that's gonna pop back in the reverse order. Okay. Sometimes we may need to change that back order, especially when we get into notifications. Oftentimes we need to change the stack, change how they kind of got there. So by default, it works pretty well. So generally speaking, we don't need to change it. If we have, say, an embedded browser, that would be a very common example where you would change the behavior so that your links, if the user clicks on a link, it goes to the next page and then you come back instead of leaving the app, right? Which would be the default behavior. Is I hit back and it doesn't go back where the page I was on previously, but it actually leaves the app. So if I do need to change how that works, I can override the onBackPressed method, right? Similar to how I override all the other methods, onCreate, onOptionItems, etc. I override onBackPress. So any app can actually do this. And if I override it to do something else, well, then that's what will happen instead. Okay. Now, if I just override it this way, notice I'm not calling the parent class, which means it actually won't do anything if I press the back button. If that's all the code I put in there, I press the back button, nothing happens. Okay. If I want to make sure it uses that default behavior, then I need to call the parent class. So I need to say super onBackPressed. So usually this logic's going to say if blah blah blah, then do this instead. Otherwise, call the parent class. That's basically what this logic's going to look like. Okay. So you can change that if you need to, but I would argue that most apps don't necessarily need to. So the next thing we can do is that's temporal navigation. We can then we can also navigate in terms of the hierarchy, and that really goes back to that idea of a sitemap, right? And we think of kind of the first screens that you start at kind of maybe up at the top, and then as you go further into the app, we kind of think is that going deeper into the tree or the sitemap. Make sense? So that navigation that we talk about refers to going kind of up the tree back towards the main screen, the start of the screen. So we think of the screens kind of at the top. Those are the parents, and then we've got the children. So if we think about reading an article, right, that story page down at the bottom, well, what's the parent of that? So if we've got the stories down at the bottom, right, talking about our news app, those are the lowest level children, right? What are the parents of that?
The topics?
The topics, right. So if we're looking at here, right, so the story, the parent is this list of articles, right? And then the parent of that is the main home screen, right? Where they picked which topic or whatnot that they're going to go with, right? So we've got the parent and the first level children and the second level children. The other thing that you see in there, so I can go up or down, but I can also go sideways, right? I might also think of sideways navigation or what we call lateral navigation, right? So if I'm going laterally, let's say I'm down on the story, that would mean moving through the story, so I'm moving laterally. So I'd be say, well, I want to pick the first headline, and then maybe I want to swipe right to get to the next one, swipe right to get to the next one. So that's usually how you kind of navigate laterally, is you're going to swipe left and right to get to the next article. Okay. But it could also mean, depending on how you've arranged it, it could also be just scrolling vertically, right? Maybe you get to the end of the article and the next one starts immediately. Either of those things would be kind of lateral navigation. Make sense? So we're not changing the level or the depth, but we're going kind of sideways. That make sense? So you can do that on the article side, but we can also do that on the topic side, right? So I might also go laterally between topics. Maybe I swipe left and I get the tech news, and I swipe left again and I get cooking, and vice versa. Does that make sense? So I can think of those things as what we call lateral navigation, either of those movements. And sometimes we'll refer to those as siblings, right? Anything that's at the same level is a sibling, right? So you got parents and children, and in that same terminology, we've got siblings are all at the same level. So when we talk about descendant, we mean going down that tree, going further, deeper into your app, and if we're doing ancestral navigation, well, then we're navigating further up. And then if we're doing lateral, again, that's kind of going sideways. So let's talk first about descendant navigation. Okay, so descendant navigation is where I'm going down. So in this case, we're kind of going from the home screen down to top stories, down to the fourth story in the list. Okay, and looking at that. Oftentimes, a good kind of pattern for descendant navigation is this, what we call the master detail flow kind of arrangement. So on the tablet, you might have, say, the articles listed over here on the left, and then you go to the individual article, or in this case, we're saying this is a settings screen, so we got groups of settings, and then we get to the specific settings for each section. Does that make sense? So here we're talking we've got groups of settings, we go to an individual setting, and that's how it would look on a tablet versus here it would look on a phone. Right? So we've got the groups of settings, and that, and here we've got the same screens, same kind of functionality, but here it's two screens and there it's one screen. Right? So if you create a new project in Android Studio, remember that you get the option to pick a template, right? So if I say start new project, I can start that with a master detail flow, okay? Which is how we kind of get to this. Now I went ahead and already built that project, so you should already have one that's called master detail flow. That's all I did, is I just started that project with the master detailed activity template. So I'm going to open that up. Yeah, so you want to open up the master detail project, and we'll look at some of the code that goes into that. So there's a lot going on here, and we won't probably talk about all of it today. But the first thing you see when you open it up is you're going to see that there's a list of items. And again, this is basically just what you get when you create a brand new project with Master Detail, because there's a lot of code that it already builds in. So I've got a list of items. I click on any of those items. I'm going to go to this other page, and you can kind of see I can read details about that item, right? So you see it's kind of broken up as two different screens. Now, if I run that same app, I'm going to switch over to a 7-inch tablet. And we can see how it's different, right? So rather than those being two separate screens, I've got the list of items and the thing on the right, okay? And the way that this works is that the part on the right, the detail screen, is really a fragment, right? It's a fragment, so we're able to use it either as part of an activity or basically as the whole activity, because we've implemented the detail screen as a fragment instead of a full-on activity. Now, let's dive into the code a little bit and see what's going on. So I'm actually going to start from the child and work our way up. So if we look at what's in the classes, right? So we can see that there's a few different classes here. We've got an item detail activity and an item list activity, right? So we need those two because they are actually separate screens on a phone, right? So we do actually have to have an activity for both of those, even if we don't use the second activity on a tablet. Make sense? So any activity that you might have, you still have to create that as an activity. But what we also see in here is the item detail fragment, right? So item detail activity is going to be a subclass of app-compat activity. Same thing with the item list, right? So both of those are activities. What makes this item detail fragment different is that it's a subclass of fragment, right? So if you want a full-blown activity, you make it a subclass of activity. If you want a fragment, it's going to be a subclass of fragments, okay? So digging into what we have here, we've got, first of all, we can see we've got a constant argid. My guess is that's going to potentially be passed from the previous screen. It would be a good guess. I can see that there's some sort of item here, right? Which is kind of the dummy data that we're passing to the view or to the fragment. You can see I've got a constructor here. That is sometimes needed, sometimes not, as far as creating an actual constructor. There may be stuff you need to do there, but as a general rule, kind of like how things work with the activities, we kind of want to avoid constructors for the most part, right? We don't want to do a lot of logic in there. What that is there for is, let's say you need I want to kind of have two or three, a few different kinds of fragments, but rather than having them be different classes, I kind of want to join them together. So that lets me kind of reuse the same logic for a few different screens rather than having separate classes. That's the reason that you may need a constructor. Okay, OnCreate. OnCreate kind of looks like it's the same signature as our, it looks like it's maybe the same signature as our activities, right? So the OnCreate gets called kind of when the fragment gets created. But the important thing to know that OnCreate actually gets called maybe at a different time than what you might expect. So OnCreate in an activity, right? When does that happen? When does that get called? Right after the intent gets sent, right? You send the intent, and Android will open up, create that activity, right? So that's the first thing that happens. So OnCreate happens in the process of Android creating the fragment, okay? Which doesn't necessarily happen during the OnCreate. It might happen while the app is running, right? So this might happen in response to an on-click listener of some sort. So don't assume that this OnCreate is going to happen at the same time. The other thing to note, what's that first method that we usually call in OnCreate for an activity? What do we usually call? Remember, we need to set up the layout. What do we call to do that? Set content view. So you would assume that I need to do the same thing for an fragment, but there is no set content view. Okay. Again, because their life cycle is a little bit different. Okay. So the OnCreate is not actually where we start dealing with controls. When the fragment gets created is actually before it gets anywhere near when it's put on screen. Okay, so we actually have to implement two different methods. So the first OnCreate, this one happens first. There's another one which is where we're actually going to do what we would normally think of doing in OnCreate. Okay, so we've got OnCreate here. You can see that it's pulling out these arguments. It's grabbing some arguments, saying, hey, does it contain this arg item ID? If it does, then we pull it out from DummyContent, get it there. So let's look at this DummyContent real quick. So DummyContent, there we go. So we got one class in here called DummyItem. You can kind of see it's a nested class because DummyItem is actually inside of the DummyContent class. It's been marked static so that it doesn't have kind of a this pointer to the DummyContent object. If you don't put static there, then you have to have a DummyContent object to create a DummyItem. So that basically makes it behave. That static keyword makes it basically behave as if it wasn't nested inside the other class. So it probably would make more sense, honestly, for them to just put that in a separate file, because basically that's what we're doing.
Doesn't static class have to have all static?
No, that's C#.
Okay.
So in C#, a static class has to have all static items. In here, static class means that you only apply that to a nested class, and that means again that it doesn't have a this pointer to the kind of containing class. So it works very differently. So inside of there, we can see that we've got a few kind of properties. We've got ID, we've got content, we've got details, right? So all of that's kind of keeping track of the items that the data that we're gonna show on the details page. Does that make sense? So we've got three pieces of data that we're showing on the details page. We've got a basic constructor, we've got a toString that just returns the content. Okay, so that's our DummyItem class. Okay, and again, you can kind of think of that as being separate from DummyContent. Okay, going back up to DummyContent. Obviously, you maybe can guess from the name dummy, this is just kind of example code. This is not something you need to bring into a real-world application. This is just enough code to make it work. In reality here, we would probably put in some database of some sort instead of having it in memory like this is. So we've got DummyContent. Inside of DummyContent is a list of dummy items. You can see there's an array list of dummy items, right? So we're basically kind of keeping this list in memory. And there's also a map, and that map goes from the ID of the item to an individual item. Okay, and they made actually both of these things public because they're going to be used in the other classes. We also have a count here, so they're going to populate it with 25 items. And then you can see that there's a static initializer, so the first time that you use this class, it's going to pre-populate both the items list and the items map with 25 items. That makes sense? That's what the static initializer does. So we say loop through from 1 to count, and then create a dummy item. So create dummy item says new dummy item. It takes the position, right? So that's where we get the numbers 1 to 25 that are showing up. That's the ID. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The actual, what we call content here, we set item plus position, and then we've got the details over here. So all of this is basically building that details that we saw right here, right? So we've got ID 1, or here we've got ID 8. Item 8 is the name of the item, and then you can see the details here, which is just say more details information, the number of times it is. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, because they're just building that up here. So all of this dummy item, dummy content is really just to create some example data. That's all that it's about. It's just some example data to work with. But the important thing to see there is that's how it builds up the items and the item map. Okay. So what we're seeing, going back to the fragment, is that we're seeing that somehow, right, we haven't gone into how, but somehow there's an argument that's being passed to this fragment, and it's extract with the name of item ID, and then we're extracting that and using the item map to retrieve the actual item. Does that make sense? So we're saying somehow that fragment's getting an ID, and then we're using that ID to go look up the actual data. So in a real-world application, that may be we get the ID of the order, and then we go send that ID off to the database or the web service and actually get the data of the order. Okay. Once I've gotten the actual item, the next thing that happens in here, we're saying, let's go grab the activity, and this is something that you have to be very wary of. So anytime you go and access the activity, right? So we're accessing the screen that this fragment is on, okay? You can do this. My experience, though, is you want to be very careful about this, because what this tends to create is situations where your quote-unquote mini activity isn't so mini, where it really knows about the screen that it's inside of. So this can be a very, very dangerous thing, in fact. So you have to be careful how you do these things. So, for instance, here we're saying, let's go grab the activity. So get activity is going to return the screen that we're on. But remember that there's maybe more than one screen in there, right? What it returns is an activity object, right? So if we want to actually do something useful with that activity, unfortunately, we do have to do a downcast of some sort. Because if I just have the activity object, there's no useful methods. I can't really communicate back with the parent screen. Okay? So in this case, what we're trying to do is trying to change the title of the page to be the title of the article. That's the goal, right? So that title doesn't exist in the fragment, it exists in the activity. Is the problem. Okay? So we have to kind of break our box and get out. And this is where maybe that analogy of partial view breaks down. Because in a partial view, you can't break out of that box. But in a fragment, you are technically allowed to. But you, again, have to be very careful about it. So here I'm saying, take the activity, and I'm saying find view by ID. Okay, so now I just said find view by ID, not on controls that are inside the fragment, but in controls that are outside the fragment, right? So I'm assuming that in the screen there is a control with the ID of toolbar layout, right? Which may or may not be there, but I'm assuming that there is, right? So let's say that there is. I'm then actually casting that to a collapsing toolbar layout. So I'm saying I'm pretty sure that actually is that kind of control. And if I do find that control, then I'm going to change the title to be whatever the content is, right? So again, the whole goal of this is to set the title of the screen. That make sense? So that's really all I'm doing in OnCreate. I'm not doing anything with the fragment itself, but I'm getting the arguments that were passed in, and then I'm setting some data outside of my own box. Ideally, you want your controls that you're working with usually to be in that fragment, but there are cases like this where you can't really avoid that. So if I want to then see where I actually do what we normally expect to be in OnCreate, I need to kind of come down here and look at the OnCreate view method. Okay, so we've got OnCreate and OnCreate view when we're dealing with fragments. OnCreate's that first one that gets called, but it's not really like what you might expect OnCreate to be. OnCreate view is where we actually start creating the controls for the fragment. Okay? So what we put in OnCreate view is really what you kind of would expect to see in OnCreate. Does that make sense? So when you're turning something from an activity into a fragment, generally speaking, you're going to have to move a lot of your code that's in OnCreate into OnCreate view.
Which one gets called first?
OnCreate. OnCreate gets called first, and then once the fragment gets what we call attached, it actually starts to get put on screen. That's where OnCreate view gets called. Okay, so until you actually put it on screen, you don't see this code. So this particular method takes a few things. So it takes an inflator, right? Remember we saw inflators at some point earlier with the menus and such, but this is not a menu inflator, it's a layout, right? So what this is going to, the inflator is used to take the layout resource file and turn it into controls. Okay. So we've got the inflator, we've also got a view group, which is the container. So that's kind of where the fragment's going to get put into, is into the container. That's kind of the parent control of where the fragment's going to go. And then we also see that we again have this bundle saved as instead, right? And that's maybe kind of similar to what we've seen before, where if we needed to turn it sideways or go to another screen, we might see some data there if we need to do a configuration change. So first thing we do is we use the inflator and we call inflate. Okay? So inflate, this inflator.inflate, is basically doing what we did in set content view. That makes sense? Remember set content view, we say here's the idea of the layout, go turn it into controls. Okay? So this basically does the same thing. Right? If you were to look at how set content view works, you would actually find an inflator underneath that implementation. Okay, but to work with a fragment, we have to maybe get what we would say maybe a little closer. We have to kind of work with what's underneath. So we say, okay, here's the layout I want you to use, right? So we're using the item detail layout for this fragment. I'm putting it into the container, so that's always my second argument there. And then the last item is attached to root. Okay. That exists there because there's a lot of different places that inflators are used. Okay. So they're pretty general. As far as building a fragment, that should always be false. Okay. Basically what that says is, yes or no, do you want me to go ahead once I've inflated it to add it to the container? So if I say true, it will go ahead and add it to the container. If I say false, it won't add it to the container. Okay? So we need to say false here because once this actually finishes, it's already going to try and do that. So if we sell it to be true, our app will actually crash because it will try to add it twice. Does that make sense? So typically, anytime you see an inflator like that, usually attached to root is going to be false. So that's one important thing you need to remember, because that's going to come up in a few different places. Generally speaking, attached to root is just going to be set to false. Okay. This also returns a view. So the inflator is going to return the root view of our layout, right? So if we're building a normal layout, what's our root view? What's usually our root view in the layout? It's probably going to be what kind of view? Let's go look at it. So I know item detail, right? I know that's the name of the layout. So let's go look at item detail. So at least according to this XML file, what is the root? Notice that there's only one tag in this layout, right? The only tag in here is a text view, right? What normally would I have at the root of my layout?
Like the tags and constraint, linear.
Constraint layout, right? Yeah. Or a linear layout, right? So at the root, normally I'm going to have some sort of layout container, right? I'm going to have a constraint layout, a relative layout, a linear layout. So that's usually what I would expect to come back from inflating this layout, is probably going to be, say, a constraint layout, okay? But in this case, it's really just returning that text view, or the parent of that text view. So when I'm going to then say, okay, assuming we have an item to display, which it is possible that I don't have an item to display, because remember when I initially open this, I don't have any items selected, in which case at the beginning, that item will be null. Okay, so that does actually happen. But if we do have an item to display, then we're going to say, okay, go to the root view and say find view by ID, find the item detail, right? So that's because we've given this an ID of item detail. What's up, Dalton?
Nothing, I think.
Okay, so basically I'm saying take that, find the text view, we're going to cast it to a text view, and then finally we're going to set the text of that text view to the details, right? So I might, in a more advanced state, I might have more than one control I need to get to, and I might want to change more of those properties. Now, I would say if you're building something like this yourself, building more advanced sort of views and fragments, most fragments, kind of like I said, find view by ID, you should only call once, and you should save it to member variables. I would generally make that same statement here. So I might say the better way to write this is again not how it's generated, but if I wanted to revise this a bit, I might say private text view again OnCreate view. So not OnCreate, but OnCreate view, which is kind of where we're doing it here already. We're just not saving it. So typically what I would see usually in an OnCreate view, usually what you want to do is something more like this. So say grab all of the controls that you care about, save them to a variable, and then I would actually use them down here. So grab all the controls and then change all the data. Does that make sense? So it basically looks like an activity.
So you couldn't do that on OnCreate
because the controls don't exist yet, right? The controls don't exist yet in OnCreate, so we have to do it in OnCreate view. Okay, and then the other important thing to remember here, this actually expects you to return a view. So at the end of this, we need to return the root view. Be very careful that you're actually returning the root view. If you were to say return this text here or one of those controls rather than the root, you're going to run into some issues because it's going to end up only showing that one control. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure at the end you're always returning the root. That's one of the things that a lot of people kind of make the mistake on is getting this last line wrong when they're working with fragments. Okay, so that's the general overview of kind of what's happening with the detail fragment. So does that make sense? It's sort of like a mini activity, but our logic here is going to largely be in OnCreate view instead of being in OnCreate. And the way we deal with inflating the layout is a little bit different. Okay, so let's go to the item detail activity now that we've kind of looked at the item detail fragment, and let's look at what's happening there. So first line, set content view. Okay, so sets that to activity item detail, right? So if we look at the layouts, notice that we have an item detail layout and we have an activity item detail, right? So this inner layout, that item detail, right? So that's the one that's used for the fragment. So usually I would actually call that one fragment _ item detail. But that's the one for the fragment, and this one is the one that's actually used for the screen. Okay, so on a tablet, right, we use the fragment layout, but we don't use the activity layout. Does that make sense? But on a phone, we use both of those things. So on the activity item detail, let's look at how this one lays out. So if you remember looking at the basic activity, right, creating the basic activity kind of template, you may have seen some of this already. So we'll see what's at the root of this is this coordinator layout. Okay, it's coordinator layout. So the coordinator layout is designed to kind of coordinate animations among several controls on screen. Okay, so for a lot of the newer functionality, we want to have this coordinator layout at the root. Okay, we generally want to have this coordinator at the root for all of the newer functionality. Okay, then beneath that, I have what's called I have this app bar layout, right? So the app bar layout controls that part that we're seeing up at the top of the screen, right? So the app bar layout is everything that's happening here, right? Where we would have our overflow menu, or we have our action buttons. It's basically replacing the standard action bar, okay? Which gets kind of interesting because in order for this to work, we actually have to turn off the standard action bar. Okay, I'll show you where we do that in a second. But if I don't turn the other one off, I would actually see two action bars here. Okay, so I have kind of a second action bar. And there's a few things in there, but let's keep going a second. So beneath the app bar, I have a nested scroll view. Okay, so we've seen a scroll view already, right? The point of a scroll view is to allow the text inside of it to be scrollable, right? So I may want that here because that detail page, if I'm looking at an article, it might get pretty long, right? So that's where there's a nested scroll view in there to say, okay, what's in here can be scrolled. Okay, and I've set the width and height of that to be match parent, so the nested scroll view is actually basically taking up the entire screen. Okay, and I've also got a floating action button, right? So I've got all that stuff in there. You notice in here that I'm not actually specifying what's kind of inside of the scroll view. So I have to actually specify that somewhere else. Is say, well, what's going to go inside of the nested scroll view? So let's look briefly at the app bar layout. Okay, so first of all, we see that we've given an ID of app bar. We see that the width of it set to match parent. The width of this should always be at match parent. You always want the app bar to be the full width of the screen. The height we've set it to this dimen app bar height, which is kind of an unusual way to set it. Let me pull up one of my other examples because it's not usually how we set the height. File, open, recent. So usually, you can kind of see here, usually your app bar layout will be set to wrap content. So why this particular template generates this way, I'm not sure, but pretty much most of the templates and the general recommendation is that should be wrap content. But we can look at where that's coming from. So if I look into values, go into the dimens file, I can see that there's a setting here. So you can see that they've set the height of it to always be 200 dp. Okay, so they've set the height of the app bar to always be 200 dp. Now, if I look at how that looks when the application's running on a phone, because again, I only see this layout on a phone, we can kind of see what they're trying to do. So you see this section, oh, went away. So you see this section up here, that's that 200 dp. So they're saying that we want this section up here to actually be taller. And the big reason I might do that is if I wanted to put an image in the background, right? That's the big reason to do that, is for stylistic reasons. So I'm actually pushing that app bar down to be taller. With the default built-in action bar, I can't actually change those kind of things. So they've got a fixed height, so I couldn't do something like that. But with the using the app bar layout, I can do that. Now, notice when I scroll up and down, do you see how that's kind of collapsing? So it starts out big, the title starts out big and maybe with an image, and it collapses down like that. So that's actually the job of the coordinator layout. That's what it's doing, is it's coordinating layouts, like it's coordinating actions like that, where you say scroll up and down, and as you're scrolling up and down or left and right, it changes the sizes of the different controls. Does that make sense? So that's the big thing that the coordinator layout is all about, is allowing us to do things like that. Nope, we just needed to have all of this stuff inside of a coordinator layout. So because that's a coordinator layout, it then automatically deals with, okay, you've got a nested scroll view which is taking up the whole place, and you've got the app bar layout in here, so it automatically resizes the app bar layout just by the coordinator layout being there. The other thing that we see in there, notice that the FAB is not on the bottom right corner, right? It's kind of floating on that divider. So if we look at how it's positioned, we can see it's got a margin of 16. We can see this anchor gravity, right? So it's anchored to item detail container, right? Well, where is item detail container? Well, it's here, right? So you can see it's anchored to the scroll view, right? And if we look at anchor gravity, top end. So vertically it's top, and left and right it's to the end. So it's anchored to the top end of the scroll view, which is what puts it there. Does that make sense? If it was connected to bottom end, it would be down here. So just by having it anchored there, the coordinator layout takes out everything. Does that make sense? So that's what our coordinator layout's about. And that's why all of these examples you'll see a coordinator layout. Because we basically add that anytime we get this app bar layout. Okay. Also means frequently when we need this coordinator layout, we're going to end up splitting our layout into two files. Because to actually design this screen, I typically want this area to be in some sort of constraint view. But because I need the parent of this to be a coordinator layout, right, I can't have the root of the layout file be a constraint view. So typically I need to put this part of the screen in another file, and we call that, say, content main or content detail. And then we keep this outer layer as activity main, activity detail, etc. Does that make sense? So you're going to see a lot of these things broken up into more than one layout. It's the same way the basic activity is set up. So inside of here, let's see what we got. So you can see that there's a theme applied. You can see that there's a theme applied to the app bar layout. Okay, so it's set to style, theme overlay, app compat, dark, action bar. So that's just a standard theme. And what that does, we can see kind of from two things in the name. We can tell that it's dark colored. So it's going to prefer a dark background. It's going to use a darker background and a lighter text. If I were to change this to, say, light, which doesn't seem to be there. Am I missing something? App compat light. Okay. Then I should see this change if I've got my cards right. Yeah, so it didn't change everything, right? You notice it didn't change the background, but it did change the color of the text. Okay. The reason it didn't change the background is because I've gone down here and we can kind of see that the background's already been set by another property down here. So that kind of overrode that. So you'll typically see some sort of theme on the app bar layout. Again, we haven't talked too much about themes yet, but they're kind of a grouping of properties or styles that we put together. So we can apply a bunch of properties at once. We've got a collapsing toolbar layout in this case. That collapsing toolbar layout is really what's causing this to get smaller, right? Because otherwise it would just stay the same size. So we've got collapsing toolbar layout, and then inside that we've got what you'll always see as this toolbar, right? So this Android X toolbar, this is really the toolbar that's actually replacing our standard kind of built-in toolbar. And one of the reasons that we do this is that older devices don't actually have support for an action bar. So we actually turn off the one that's built into the device, and we use our custom one here, which means that it doesn't depend on resources that are already built into the system, which means your action bar still works the same way on much older devices. That's part of why we do this. But it also means that we have to do a little bit of workaround to make the toolbar work in the same way that the original one did. So we'll pay attention to kind of the width and the height. Again, the width's always set to match parent. The height here is pulling from something question mark ATR action bar side. You see that? So that's what you always want to put there, and it's kind of pulling from a setting that's actually built into Android. That's what that question mark means. If there was an @ sign, right, If there's just app mem, we would know that it's in our mem file, but because it's question mark ATTR, it's actually coming from a theme. And we haven't really thought about themes yet, but that's what's happening. Okay? But that's what we want to set all of our toolbars to. Okay? And then finally we have another kind of theme. So that's all the toolbar. Okay? This is kind of going to be one of the more complicated examples because it's really that collapsing. And so usually they have a little bit less. Let's go ahead and take a quick break. Come back at 1:55. So I do kind of apologize for spending a lot of time on the toolbar. You know, it seems like a kind of a little thing, but the reason I'm trying to explain the whole thing is because all of these examples are going to use that toolbar. So you really need to understand what's going on there. Another thing I want you to pay, so anytime we're using this toolbar, you'll notice that there's three parts that we have to have. We have to have a coordinator layout, and then inside of that coordinator layout, we need to have an app bar layout, and then underneath, we need to have a toolbar layout, a toolbar. Those three controls are required to use this new toolbar. Okay, you need to have all three of those things in place. So the coordinator first on the outside. Inside of that, you need the app bar layout, and then the toolbar. Okay, and it is important that the app bar layout appears before all the rest of your content, because you can kind of think of the coordinator layout sort of as a linear layout. It does matter what order things are in, kind of, or at least we typically put it in that order. Okay, so those are the three you need to have. Now, let's look real briefly. Notice what packages they're in. So we've got AndroidX.coordinatorlayout.widget. We've got, down at the toolbar, we've got AndroidX.appcompat.widget. And I've got com.google.androidMaterialAppBar, right? So with those three namespaces, one thing I know for sure is I'm going to have to bring in some additional dependencies, okay? I'm going to have some additional dependencies. So we've got appcompat here, we've got that there. If I go look at the implementation, I'll go with my dependencies. So this first dependency that we have here, appcompat, all your projects will have that one because we have appcompat activities, right? So the basic toolbar is in appcompat, okay? However, the app bar lives over in this dependency, com Google Android Material, okay? This is actually where everything that used to be in design has been moved in this com Android Material. So you'll see that if you're going through the labs, they may ask you to import the design, the support design dependency. That's what you want instead. Instead of the old support design dependency, you want com Google Android Material. That's what has that's where all of that stuff is moved. So those are the two that you want to make sure you have in your code. Appcompat and Material. And that's really all the ones that you'll need to do everything today, is those two dependencies, is appcompat and Material. Questions? So everything that we need to do today is in those two dependencies. Okay. So one thing I mentioned earlier is that we're kind of replacing the built-in toolbar, right? So let me show you what happens if you don't turn off the existing toolbar. Okay, so the way we turn off the existing toolbar is we go here to the activity. You'll see that there's a theme applied to it. That theme is actually how we're turning off the built-in toolbar, okay, because you have to use a theme to do that. If I change this from app theme, you see this is app theme, no action bar. See the default theme on the application is app theme, but I'm saying for this specific activity, use a different theme. Okay, so I need to use that different theme anytime I want to use this special app, this special action bar. So if I were to just use app theme here, which is the default, say I'm going to remove that from both of these screens actually. Told it to run. Master detail keeps stopping. Looks like the code is depending on the other one not being there. Well, what did I do? Oh, did I? Let me go back. There we go. So that's back where I was. Yeah, I may need to check logcat, but I'm trying to get it to run without crashing. Okay, so I couldn't change it on the first one. Let me change it here to just app theme. And again. Okay, so here in fact it's crashing because it's actually kind of expecting the default one not to be there. So I may have to do that come back and look at that on a different, more simple example. But basically what would happen is that you would have two action bars on top of each other. Yeah.
What I noticed when I was going through those labs,
Uh-huh.
when I used the regular toolbar, it did not work at all.
Right. Yeah, there may be some things that just full on depend on it not being there. So there's a few lines of code in both of these activities. Both if I look at item detail activity and item list activity, you'll see these two lines of code. So what does it say? So find view by ID. So we're going to go grab the toolbar with ID toolbar. And typically every screen we're going to give that the same ID. It's always going to be ID toolbar. We don't need it. So we say go grab the toolbar and then call set support action bar. If you don't call this, you're going to have a lot of issues with your action bar. If you don't call set support action bar. So let me remove this for one, and we can see some of the things that happen. Okay, so right now with it there, you'll see that there's an arrow, right? And there's the text in here, right? So if I've got an up arrow and it's item 8, right? If I just remove that one line of code, oh, actually, I'm on the wrong activity because I want to do this on the detail activity. So set support action bar and go in here. Notice that the up arrow is missing. Right. So as it turns out, it is still showing the title because we're setting the title elsewhere, but oftentimes if you don't call that, you'll also find that the title is blank. Okay, so you want to make sure that you call set support action bar because that's going to actually kind of hook it up. So if you don't call that, you may have some weird behavior. So for instance, if we get to when we get to the drawer, you won't actually see the button for the drawer if you don't call set support action bar. Okay. So that's what you have to have here. So remember, you have to have a coordinator layout, an app bar layout, and a toolbar in the layout file, and then you have to have these two lines of code in your activity code. Okay, that's what makes the new app bar work, plus changing the theme. So you can see, as we were talking about the theme, so here we've got app theme dot no action bar is the one that we want. Now, when you create a app just from the empty activity, you won't actually have this no action bar theme. So you will actually need to add it. So we'll look at that in a minute when I look at one of the more simple examples, but we will actually need to, you may potentially need to add that theme, okay? If I look at the item detail activity, so kind of skipping past, hey, we're dealing with the support bar, yada yada. Let's go down to looking at just these. So the item detail activity, where are we actually showing the fragment? So I've got the fragment shown here. Yeah, so that's basically it. Oh, so it only gets done the first time. So here's our logic that's actually pushing that in the fragment. So we're no longer looking at arguments. We'll look at the item detail fragment. We've got some arguments options, right? So what we can see here is where we're actually building the arguments. So the arguments is a bundle, okay? So we're taking a bundle, we're adding in the item ID. You can see we're using that constant we saw over in the fragment. And we're adding in it as a string. We're saying get string extra, so we're actually getting it from the intent that this string was opened with, right? So the list is where you're actually picking the item. So we have to pull it out of the intent there and put it into the arguments for the fragment, right? So you pick the ID on the first screen, it goes to the second screen, and then that second screen passes it down to the fragment. Does that make sense? So you're just passing it along. So we create that bundle with the arguments. Next, we actually create the fragment. So we say create a new item detail fragment. We say set arguments to pass it that argument that we just built. And then we're finally, in order to actually show the fragment on screen, we need to use the fragment manager. So we're calling get support fragment manager. The reason we're calling get support fragment manager is because older versions of Android did not have a fragment manager. So that's also another thing from the support methods. Okay. So get support fragment manager, begin transaction that kind of says I want to start making changes to the fragments that are visible. And then when I finish making those changes, we call it commit. So begin transaction kind of starts the operation, and then commit finishes it. So I could actually make more than one change in between those two things. Does that make sense? I could make more than one change to what fragments are doing. So in there I say add. We're going to add in this fragment, and I just created up here, and I'm going to put it into ID item detail container. Right? Where is item detail container? What is that? So it's in the layout that we were just looking at, right? So if we look back at the activity layout for our activity detail page, activity detail layout, we'll see that that's the nested scroll. So I'm creating a fragment, and then this is where I'm actually taking that fragment and putting it into the nested scroll. Does that make sense? So I'm not actually declaring in the XML what's going to go in there. I'm declaring it. So that's one of those kind of weird things with fragments is rather than declaring what fragment goes into a particular container in the XML, we always have to put those fragments in Java. So sometimes when you're working with fragments, you have to do a little bit more back and forth. Well, item detail container, right? there is activity item detail. It's right here. See? So it's going inside of that nested scroll. Does that make sense? That's because the nested scroll view holds a fragment. It's basically a fragment container. Okay, so that's how we actually set that up. And you'll notice that we're, at least the way they've set this up, they're only doing this like the first time. So if we rotate the screen, it's actually not doing this the second time. Okay, so that's the item detail. Let's backtrack back to the item list. So the item list, again, set content view. We've got these two lines that are setting up the toolbar. And then finally you see we're saying toolbar set title is equal, set title to get title. Right? Well, what is get title? Okay, so it's returning the title of the activity. So we're taking the title of the activity and putting it into the toolbar, at least initially. Okay, now remember, if you, from the fragment, remember we're going to change that down the road, right? So when you actually look at a story, you're going to see that show up as the title. Okay, so let me look at this on a tablet. So initially nothing selected. So we're going to go ahead and at the beginning we're setting the title to be this master detail. Okay. And then when I pick an item, potentially I may want to change that. Yes. It may or may not. Kind of depends. So I think I'm not entirely sure what the case is why they've got this one in here, but yes, usually it's gonna, usually this kind of takes care of that. But if you do get it around, sometimes you need to dynamically kind of change the title based on what's selected. You may need to set it initially to the right thing. So that's what's happening there. We're then setting up a basic, the floating action button is just showing a toast. And then we've got our item detail container. So we're saying let's go try and find the item detail container. But notice that there's a check here saying go and try to find it. Okay. And if we do find it, then we're changing toPane to true. Otherwise it's false. Okay. The reason that's relevant, let's look at our item, or look at our layout here. You can kind of see that we've got two different layouts. So I've got item lists and another item list. This one's for 900 dp or larger. Right? So if I've got a screen that's width 900 dp or larger, then I'm going to use this layout instead. So this layout, the wider layout, where is it here? So we've got this frame layout item detail container, right? So in the wider layout, we have a recycler view, which is that list of items. And then after that, I have a frame layout, right? So these are in a linear layout that's horizontal. So you can see that the recycler view is going to be next to the frame layout. However, in the layout that I use for a smaller screen, notice that there's just a recycler view, right? Notice that there's just a recycler view. So basically what we're doing in the code, in the activity code here, we're determining which layout is it using. Does that make sense? By the presence or absence of that control. So if that control does exist, if we have a layout that is using that that item, that container, then we're going to treat it as two panes and do it all in one screen. But if it's not there, then we're going to go back to the phone version. Does that make sense? So that's how we're determining this two pane, is it true or false? So by default it's false. It's going to get set to true if we're in that special layout. Okay. And then we grab the recycler view. We're doing some basic setup with the recycler view. So I want to go into all of how the recycler view works today, because we'll talk about that with 4.5. But basically what we're saying is then once the user clicks on an item in that list, then if two pane is false, we're going to open a new screen. If two pane is true, then we're going to put a fragment into that frame layout. That make sense? Which we can kind of see if we look down here. Again, not getting too deep into it, but we've got some sort of on-click listener where we're saying if it is two pane, well, if it's not two pane, we go down here, we create an intent, start that activity. If it is two pane, then I'm going to take the item ID, put it into that bundle, create a fragment, set the arguments, and then replace. And you see replace happening. Replace what's in the item detail container with the fragment. So it's kind of like what we saw over on the other activity. Does that make sense? So that's how we're conditionally doing one thing, because we have two different setups. So we're not actually detecting specifically which layout file is being opened. We're detecting whether or not a control is there. Does that make sense? So usually you have all of your layouts have the same controls and the same IDs, but this is a case where we have one layout has a control that the other layout doesn't. Makes sense? And that's part of why when we're working with these controls, sometimes we need to make sure we check for null. And because one variant of the layout might have that, and one variant of the layout might not have that. Does that make sense? That's why you a lot of times see a null check. Okay. Any questions on the master detail setup? You understand what's happening there now? Can you see where that fragment's useful? You can kind of see that fragment's being used in either of those two pathways. So that's kind of a common setup. There's other ways that we can deal with descendant navigation. We can use something called the navigation drawer. And we can just use buttons or image buttons to say, go to the next screen, like we've done before. We can use anything really that's clickable. We could just say, click on this, you go to the other screen, right? Or we could do like we were looking at with the master detail, we have some sort of list that the user clicks on and goes to the next screen. So what I want to talk about next is the navigation drawer. Okay, so the navigation drawer looks like this. It's a kind of typically descendant navigation. There's a little triple hamburger that shows up on the left that gives you an indication that there is one. So if you click on that, it will pop out. You can also actually swipe in from the left to bring in the navigation bar. And either of those ways will let you get in. What it allows you then to do is have a bunch of links to different pages of your app, different activities. Okay? It actually uses a menu. Okay? Actually uses a menu resource. So these texts that are here and these icons, those are all coming from the menu resource. Okay? You'll also notice that there's groups in that. Well, as it turns out, you can do that with any menu. You actually group items in it. Okay. And then finally up at the top, you'll see that there's a header section. Okay. So this part down here is inflated from the menu. That part up there is actually a freeform layout. You can put any kind of layout you want up there. It actually takes a layout file for it. Does that make sense? So it gives you kind of some additional space to put things. Now, typically, we only put a drawer like this on the main or home screen of your app. Usually, you don't see these on any other screens. Does that make sense? So that's one big thing to keep in mind as we look for the code of this. Remember that you're usually only going to put this on the very first screen. So the way that you create this requires kind of a few different parts. So to get the navigation drawer, we first of all need a navigation drawer kind of at the root of our layout. Okay, so we're going to have navigation drawer at the root, and then beneath that, inside of that navigation drawer, we actually need what's called a navigation view. That navigation view is actually the contents of the drawer. So navigation, so the navigation drawer is the part the kind of, or the drawer layout is the part that deals with swiping it in and swiping it out. But the navigation view is what actually shows up inside of that container. Does that make sense? So there's two parts to it. And then finally, at least the way the default, if you say create a drawer layout, create a new activity or a new project with the drawer layout, it's actually going to break this up into a few different layouts. So at the top we have a layout that has the drawer, and then beneath that we have another layout that has the app bar, the stuff that we were just kind of looking at. And then beneath that, then we have a content layout, which is actually the contents of the screen. Does that make sense? So you got three different layouts actually that make up one screen. And then you may also have a layout for the header of the drawer, which is this section up here. So this can get complicated quickly because notice that I just said there's 4 layouts for this one screen. You can actually reduce some of that with some finagling, but it does mean that you have a lot of layouts for one screen, which that's part of the reason I say, remember, you only really need to do this for your first screen. You don't need to do this on every screen in the app. This is really just for the first screen. Okay. So the way this looks, we're going to have first, we're on the main screen, so we're going to have activity main XML, so 4 layout. We're going to have a drawer layout on the outside, okay, and we have a navigation view here, right? So the two things that you'll see in the activity main are a drawer layout on the outside and the navigation view inside of that. Okay? And then what you also see above the navigation view, it will be including another layout. Okay? So while we're looking here, let me actually pull up the code for this so you can kind of see this in practice. So here is, actually I want to open up the navigation drawer project. So this navigation drawer project is what you get when you just say, hey, I want to create a new project, and the first activity needs to be a navigation drawer. Okay, so it has quite a few files in it. If I look under Java, you'll see that there's a main activity, but there's also a bunch of other classes in here. Okay, so in the layout, so let's look at activity main, right? So this is the outer level of layout. Okay, so we can see there's a drawer layout, and here is the navigation view. So drawer layout, navigation view. Okay. So the drawer layout is what allows it to slide in. The navigation view is the part that we see once we slid it. Okay, and then we're saying include. Anytime you put the include tag, you're saying include this other layout into my layout as if they were kind of one file. That makes sense? The reason we're doing that is because otherwise there would just be a whole lot of code in this one file. So it makes it easier to work with, but it also may be necessary if you want to use a constraint layout, because the constraint layout needs to be up the root. So that way it can kind of be up the root. Okay? So we've got the width and height definitely set to match parent. You can see that the navigation view is set to wrap content for the width and match height for the parent. You always want those two things there. You always want it to be as tall as the screen, but only as wide as it needs. That kind of makes sense, because it's kind of drawing in from the left hand side. Okay, so I'm saying include this other layer, the app bar name. Right? So all of this is just really about setting up the drawer. Okay? The next one is app bar name, which is where we're going to see all the application bar stuff that we saw previously. So let me go to app bar main. Okay. So keep in mind that everything that we have here is inside of the drawer layout. So I have a coordinator layout, an app bar layout, and a toolbar. Right? So all of that right there is just to set up the toolbar. And then finally, and I also have my floating action button here if I need a floating action button. And finally, I'm including content main. Right? So I've got the drawer layout, and then a coordinator layout, and then content main. So content main is where I'm finally going to see my constraint layout.
So in the last project, that was done through the code, right? To bring in the content main.
We had a nested scroll view, remember,
Yeah.
there, instead of including another file. But we had a fragment there. So here I don't have a fragment.
Oh, okay. So that's just,
I don't have a fragment right now. So this is going to another file. So right now I have 3 layouts nested there, and I haven't gotten any fragments yet. Right? Remember in the other one we had the main layout, which there was no drawer, so that was just it. It was just the constraint layout, which is kind of this tier that defined the app bar. And it had the nested scroll view, which was where we put the fragment into. Okay. So let's go deeper down the rabbit hole. So content main, this is where I actually can put my logic. Okay. So now I've got a constraint layout that I can put in wherever I want. However, the way they've set up this project makes that there's now a fragment. So this is where the actual content of the page is. Okay. So here's a fragment tag. They're giving it ID now host fragment. So what they're actually doing then is the way this project is set up is that when you click an item in the drawer, it doesn't actually change pages. None of the items in the drawer actually cause a change in the activity. The only thing they do is they replace the fragment that shows up in the middle of the page. Does that make sense? Now, that's not required. This is the way this project's set up, which is why I want to show you an easier way to do this. But that's the way that if you just say create a new project with a drawer layout, you're going to get all this. Okay. So you can kind of see that. They've got drawer layout, coordinated layout, and then inside here we've got a relative layout, and all that kind of tiers in 3 different files. Right. Now notice that they're doing relative layout. So as you're reading through the documentation, You may see some references to doing relative layout there. Obviously, I'd recommend using a constraint layout there. But that's where, if you're trying to understand what they're saying about the documentation, that's what they're assuming in this chapter. They're assuming that there's a relative layout. Okay, so there's a few different steps that have to happen. We need to, in setting that up, we need to populate that drawer, right? The navigation view with a menu that contains all the titles and icons. We also need to set up some logic so that if you click the hamburger or you swipe in, it kind of comes in, etc., or to make sure that icon shows up. And then finally, when you actually pick an item, to make it do something. All right. So this example project navigation drawer, that's the one that you get if you just start a new project with a navigation drawer. What I'm going to open up now is another example project. I call it navigation drawer from empty. So this is where I started with an empty template and added the navigation drawer to it. Okay, which actually is going to mean that it's a little bit simpler than that starter project because there's a few things I was able to remove or simplify. Okay, so here on the root, I've got an activity main layout. And what I've actually done is I've combined those top two layouts because you don't really need to have those as two separate files. So I have the drawer layout, the coordinator layout, the app bar layout with toolbar. I have all that stuff combined into one file instead of being two. That's okay. They don't really need to be two files. And then inside of there, we have this navigation. We have the navigation view there. You can see I'm including content main. Okay, so basically what I've done is I've taken those two, the app bar main and the activity main, and put those into one file. Because there's not really a good reason to have them separate. And that makes it easier to get here. Okay, and then finally I have content main, which is what we're kind of used to. It's a constraint layout with a text view that says hello. Right? Simple as can be. So this is normally where you might start, right? So you might ask, how did I get from this one layout to two? Okay, so the way I do that, typically, and the easiest way to get there if you're starting from an empty activity is to right-click on activity main, to say copy it and paste it, and call that copy content main. So make a copy of activity main, and then go to activity main and tweak it all to have all the app bar stuff. Does that make sense? So start with the layout that you need. You're going to have it activity main, just to make a copy and call that copy content main. That's kind of the easiest way to start. Okay. Now, going back to the actual activity, once you've created that, do make sure that this says activity main. Okay, because the order you create those and can result in that getting renamed to content main. So you want to make sure that you go back and change that to activity main if it did happen. Does that make sense? So it's part of why I do the duplicate process, because then this doesn't get renamed. But if you try to put in the app bar stuff first and then the content next, you're going to find that this gets renamed and you'll have to go back and change it. Okay, so the next thing I need to then do is go through here and get all the controls. So I'm going to say, let's grab the toolbar, let's grab the drawer, let's grab the navigation view. Remember, I need the toolbar to set up the app bar, and I need these two parts for the drawer. Okay, so I've got the drawer layout and the navigation. Okay. So now to set up the action bar, remember I need to call set support action bar. And then here's my logic that I need to go through to start setting up the drawer. So in order for there to be a toggle button, I need to create that. So I'm going to say action bar top. We're going to create a new action bar toggle. That's the button that appears on the left that looks like a hamburger. Okay. So we're going to create that, tell it the activity. We can tell it about the drawer as well as the toolbar. So it's got to connect those two things, the drawer and the toolbar, together. And then we need to give it some strings. So open navigation bar, close navigation bar. What I have there is actually string resources. It's hinting them as that. So those are actually over in that one. You have to have those texts for accessibility purposes. So does that make sense? So this is that hamburger, right? So once I've created the hamburger button, I then need to hook it up. So I first need to hook it up to the drawer. So I say when the drawer opens or closes, the toggle button needs to know about that because it's going to change its icon. It's going to actually animate. So it needs to know when the drawer opens and closes. But then I also need to synchronize the state of it with the state of the drawer. And say, find out if it's open or closed and update the icon accordingly. So those are the next two lines that you have to remember. Otherwise, it won't actually necessarily be doing both of those things, make sure that it appears, as well as make sure it works. Okay, you just created it won't work. Okay. So that's setting up the toggle. Let's run this real quick just so you can see all of that running. Okay, so there's my little hamburger icon. I click it, it opens up. And remember, I've set the width to wrap content, so it's only taking up as much space as it needs to. But if I click out here, you can kind of see, if you watch closely, you can see the icon kind of shifting. It basically turns sideways when you open it and then goes back to horizontal when you close it. Now, one of the things I mentioned previously in here, let me go to the manifest, and I'm going to change this one to just the regular app theme. They should both show up, at least they did when I was testing it. Although it looks like maybe it's crashing this time. Yep, it crashes this time. I don't know what did I change? Oh, it may be that I put this logic in. So let me take that logic out for a moment. Because I think this logic depends on the theme change. Yeah, there we go. See? So it's either going to crash or show you two action bars, right? So this is the built-in action bar that we had to turn off. And then the second one down here is that app bar layout. Does that make sense? Essen? Essen? So this is the built-in action bar, and then this is that app bar layout. So let me put that back in. But you can see, so the hamburger is not showing up, but I can still drag in. There. Oh, I need to put that back. So if you just take an empty, activity kind of application, you won't actually have this no action bar theme. You'll just have the app theme. So you will need to go in and change that. So the way I added that is I go into values, into the styles XML. Okay, so in styles XML, you can see that there's the app theme. So this will be in here by default. Okay. What I had to add is this tag down here, the app theme dot no action bar. So I need to add that in there. Because of this dot, this actually says, when you see a theme like this that's got a dot, this actually says it's a subclass, basically a subclass theme. So this theme actually inherits all of the properties from the app theme, but adds 2 additional settings. So the 2 additional settings in here is window action bar, so we're going to turn off the action bar, and we're going to say window and title. So those 2 settings together turn off built-in action bar. Okay, the reason that there's those 2 settings is because basically the action bar, the first setting, is for kind of the newer action bar, and window no title is for the very old action bar. I think this was prior to 15. API 15 is when it was the title bar instead of action bar. But we need to set both of those things to turn it off. Okay, so that style there won't be here. If you're just starting with a blank project, you'll just need to know to add that. And it's always that way. It's always those 2 settings. Does that make sense? I've also had to add these 2 things here, which are kind of subclasses of built-in themes based on the dark action bar and the AppCompat light. Those are used for the actual action bar. These 2 themes I'm using, or those 2 styles really, that's what you're seeing in activity main here. So you can see that I've applied app theme.app overlay and app theme.pop overlay. Those are needed in the full part. But that's where they came from, because they won't be in your styles XML file. So that's one of the many reasons I wanted to do this example project, because there's a few of these things that if you're just starting from an empty activity, you may not be obvious where they come from. So those are things you have to potentially add to your styles XML. Okay. All right, so coming back to the code behind. So that synced up the toggle button. And then finally, I need to actually hook up a listener for when the user picks an item from the drawer, right? So in my case, my menu, which you can see here, called the app bar main drawer, just has 2 items in it. So it has a home and it has a settings, both with icons on them. So if I hook up listener here, navigation on item selected listener, and notice I'm hooking it up to the navigation view. I'm not hooking it up to the drawer layout, I'm hooking it up to the navigation view. Okay, so in the navigation view I'm saying if you select nav home, then we're going to show a toast that says home. If you pick nav settings, we're just going to show a toast that says settings. So you could put any code you want in those 2 places. Does that make sense? You can literally do anything in response to those 2 menu items. And it basically behaves just like all the menus that we've seen before. Remember in 4.3? It's the same way. We have a switch statement and we say treat each of those. Actually, this should probably be default. I don't know why I didn't do that as default. So does that make sense for how you set up a navigation drawer? There's a good number of steps that can have kind of a gotcha there, but that's how I set it up, and that's me setting up with the Android X support instead of the old support library. That makes sense? So the big thing you have to change if you're transitioning from the support to Android X is you're going to change what these imports are. So you'll notice they all come from Android X instead of coming from the support libraries. And then in the Gradle, as I mentioned previously, that's the dependency that you need. Any other questions about the drawer? I should probably mention where that menu is hooked up. In the navigation view, there's the menu setting right there. So that's how I linked it to the menu resource.
So that's like in the Google Android material.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Where is that like? Where can you find those controls at?
Yeah. So if I want to look up, say, the navigation view control, so I can go to developer.android.com and search for navigation view. Now, if you look here, generally speaking, the first result that comes up is going to be the old support library. You can kind of see the header above here. You can see that it's in Android support, right, design. What you need to look through is just go a little bit further in the search results. So, because it generally will be here, I might have to put in Android X to find it. Yeah, so there it is. So there is a page for it, just like all the other controls. You just have to make sure you're looking at the one for the Android X package instead of looking at the one for the support library. Does that make sense? Because they both have the same name. They're just in a different namespace. Okay. So that's how we set up a drawer. And again, a drawer is kind of one way to do descendant navigation, because your general expectation of what should be in the drawer is all kind of that only is at your main screen, and then that's how you get to the other pages. Okay. So the other way that we can do descendant navigation, we can use a recycler view to have a list, right? Which you kind of think of a list of articles, or a list of orders, or a list of products, or a list of customers, any of those kind of things. We've also arranged things in a grid view. You might see that maybe, hey, I want a grid of cards, right? Think for a product with images and such. But we can also see kind of lateral navigation. We can kind of see, hey, maybe you have a carousel that spins. All of those kind of things can be used to do descendant navigation. You have a lot of options. So going kind of backtracking a little bit, we talked about that's one way to do descendant navigation. Bear in mind that the navigation drawer is not the only way to do that. It's just one way to do it. Okay. The ancestral navigation, we do that with the up arrow. Typically, that's the answer. So you put that little up arrow in the top left. It's going to say go up to the parent screen. And remember, the way to set that up is you go into the manifest and you set parent activity name and list of metadata. You set those two things to point to same main activity. So here we're in the order activity, you do that, and you go back. So that's really all you have to do generally for up navigation, unless you're dealing with fragments. You may have some special cases. So dealing with lateral navigation, which is kind of the last piece here. So we talked about briefly about our temporal navigation using the back button. We talked about the up arrow. We talked about how to do descendant navigation, which again, normally you're just going to say open another screen, but you can do things with, say, a navigation bar to support the descendant navigation. Now, to support lateral navigation, we're talking about going between symbols. Okay? Now, typically, a lateral navigation is supported one of two ways. It's usually supported either by a set of tabs up at the top, or by swiping left or right. Okay? And in fact, what we're going to do here is both. So you can either swipe the screen left or right, or you can click on a tab. So the two ways that might come up, you might say, well, I want to switch between top stories or tech news. I might switch those different tabs, or I might say I want to switch between different articles. The one that we're really going to talk about today is really how would I do this one with tabs. So by default, you're going to have one tab selected. Generally speaking, the first tab will be selected, and then you can navigate to different tabs that will put buttons up here or swiping up here. Right? So you can kind of see how the tabs are up here. They're kind of actually part of the app bar, right? You see they're kind of nested in the app bar. So actually showing you how to do that. So there's going to be one part here. This is what we call a tab layout up at the top. And we're actually going to put that inside of the app bar layout. And then we have down here a view pager. Okay, that view pager is what actually deals with being able to swipe left and right. Okay, but this view pager contains fragments. Okay, so when I go to a different tab, I'm actually swapping out one fragment for another fragment. Right. So the way I design these are being fragments, kind of mini activities. Does that make sense? So each of these three tabs is a separate fragment, which means that if I hit, say, the back arrow on my device, right, I never switch screens, it's not going to switch tabs if I hit the back arrow. It's just going to leave the screen.
Could you make it one fragment and have it change?
Not with the view pager. Not with the view pager. It will actually, every time you switch a tab, it will switch to a different fragment. Great. It will just kind of, I think, well, there's two ways to set this one up. Depending on how you set it up, it will either create or destroy the fragment every time, or it may actually create all three of the fragments and kind of use them when you get to them. So the point of where this navigation really shines is it does remove kind of one of the button clicks that you have to do oftentimes. So if I just had this as, we talked originally, I could have done this as 3 screens, right? So the first screen is the main activity, and then the second screen is the 3 lists of articles, right? I can combine those two so the user doesn't have to say, hey, I want to go from tech news to top stories. I don't have to go back up to the parent and then down, right? So by facilitating this lateral navigation, it removes one of the button presses. Does that make sense? That's the big advantage, is it takes that one button press from that. So general guidelines for working with tabs, you always want to lay out the tabs horizontally. Okay, vertical tabs are bad. You always want the tabs generally horizontally. That's just general what the users expect. Expect them horizontally. And part of that is because when you scroll, you're scrolling up and down, right? So if I swipe left and right, I kind of expect that to travel laterally. So it makes sense to have the tabs lateral. We also want to make sure that those tabs are up towards the top of the screen. Again, it's not required, but it's a user expectation that they're going to be up at the top of the screen. And then you want to make sure that they persist wherever it kind of makes sense. So these tabs in some cases may be on more than one screen, or they may be just one screen. It really depends on what your kind of context or user expectation is. And then also, as you can kind of see, switching tabs shouldn't be treated as history. So hitting the back arrow should not go through me switching tabs. All right, so there's a few different steps to make this work. So first and foremost, we need a tab layout. Let's see, is there a screenshot here? Well, I'll kind of go over it here. So there's the tab layout, is that up here, and then this down here is my view pager. Okay, so I need to create the tab layout. I need to define a fragment for each tab that I'm going to show. If they're different tabs, obviously, if they're showing different content, I'm going to need different fragment classes for each of those. That being said, if I have those 3 lists of articles, they're basically the same thing. I could actually use the same fragment class for each of those 3. Does that make sense? So usually, because if they're vastly different, your tabs are vastly different, you're going to have a different fragment class for each. But if they're very similar or they're nearly identical, you can actually use the same fragment class and kind of share them. Now, the next thing we need is a pager adapter. We have to create a subclass of that because pager adapter is abstract. And that's what's actually going to take from the tabs. We're going to say from index, I want tab or page 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Take the index and turn it into a fragment. So that's what goes back and forth. That takes our index, turns it into a fragment. That can either be a subclass of fragment page adapter or fragment state page adapter. Okay. Now, assuming you've done some of the reading, what did they say in 4.4 was the difference between those two? Where might you use one and where might you use the other? They're very close. We can actually use either for a tab. Tab layout. So pull up 4.4, see if you can find where those are referenced. Look for fragment pager adapter or just pager adapter. It should come up. You look at the concepts. The actual page. Oh. Here. No, on the documentation. So remember, there's the concepts. So that's the code types. There's another half. So look for and look on those. You find the different one-time versions of those. Lesson 4. So you see the content, all of that. Go to the chapter. What's the difference between a fragment pager adapter and a fragment state? Because it's in that document somewhere. And look at 4. say that it's in the deep reading material, but it's not actually in the slides. So go back and look at the concepts section. Huh?
The fragment pager is for fixed number of screens, and the fragment state is for another terminal.
Right. So the fragment pager is if we have a small number of tabs, basically, that are known ahead of time, right? Versus the fragment state page adapter is for when you have a large number of pages that you don't know ahead of time, right? So if I have, say, three tabs, a fragment page adapter is going to do that, right? But if I have a list, right, I have a list of items or list of documents or list of articles, then I'm going to want to use the fragment state adapter. The difference is that the fragment pager adapter goes ahead and creates all of the tabs and then keeps them around. So it uses memory for all the tabs, even if you don't have them open. That makes sense? It uses a lot more resources. What the fragment state pager adapter does is anytime you go to a tab, creates it, and it deletes the previous one. So it's only ever keeping around the current tab. That makes sense? But that also means that you have to save the state potentially when you leave a tab, right? So remember how we had to do the save and load, save and restore? Right? We had to save and restore the individual activities if you do a rotation. Well, we have to make sure we do that when we're using the fragment state pager adapter. Because otherwise we'll lose any user activities when we switch tabs. Now, if the user's just reading an article, that's not really all that important because they're not typing anything in. But if these are, say, these are tabs that are part of a form, right, we don't want the user to lose the values that they entered previously. Does that make sense? So there is a significant difference between the two, and that's what you want to know. Is for the fragment state pager adapter will generally need less memory will always need less memory because it's only using one tab versus the other one is keeping all the tabs. But that means that switching tabs is generally quicker with the fragment pager adapter than it is with a state page adapter. Does that make sense? Because it's keeping all the tabs in memory, switching is faster. So there's a trade-off there between, do you have a lot of tabs or do you have a few tabs? Is generally where that lies. Okay. Then, so we create the tab layout, and then we're going to add in a pager adapter, and the pager adapter is going to do the translation from tab index or page index to actual fragment object. And then we need to hook up some listeners. Because anytime you swipe left or right, we want the tab layout to know about that, so it reflects the new tab that you're on. And anytime you pick a new tab, we also want that to change what fragments show. Right? So we need to actually put a listener in both directions. So we need a listener that's listening for you swiping left or right that updates the current tab. So we also need one that when you say pick a different tab, changes it in the page adapter. Or sorry, the page keyword. Does that make sense? So we're going to have actually two listeners there. Okay. So the thing to remember, the actual labs are going to have you go through and use a tab layout. They're going to tell you to use COM Android Support Design 2610. Use this one instead. That makes sense? This one's going to give you the newer Android X controls. So when they tell you to use this, actually use that one instead. Okay. So we'll need to define the tab layout. The tab layout, we're going to use this one. I've already changed this from the previous support library. So we're going to use tab layout from Google Landing Material. The way I've set this up, you can kind of see I've given it the ID of tab layout. I've set the width to match parent so it occupies the whole width of the screen, and then it's only as tall as it needs to be. Okay? So that's typically, again, what you're going to see there. Just like you would see with the toolbar, toolbars match parent and then wrap content the same way with the tabs. Okay? And then you can set the background color to whatever you want. You can set the color primary dark. I'm going to set it to color primary dark so it's clearer where the toolbar ends and the tabs start. And then we also need to add in the view pager. So basically we've got the toolbar, the tab layout, and then the view pager in our layout. Okay? And these are match parent, right? So it takes up the entire screen conceptually. So if I open up, let's see, open recent. I'm going to open up tabbed activity from empty. Same kind of way with the others. That tabbed activity example is just if you create a new project with the tabbed activity template, that's what you'll get. This is from empty is where I've taken the empty template and put the tabs in there. Okay, so I've got my dependency. I'm going to go into the layout so we can look at what the layout actually looks like. So as previously, I've got coordinator layout on the outside, app bar layout, and then the toolbar. So you'll see inside of the app bar layout now I have both the toolbar and the tab layout. Make sense? Previously I just had the toolbar in there. So that's going to mean if for whatever reason I need to animate, scroll down, the tab layout's going to get kind of stuck with the toolbar rather than moving around. If you don't do that, you just put the tab layout out here, not inside of the app bar layout, then it may scroll up when you scroll down. Okay, so I've got the tab layout inside the app bar layout, and then I've got my view pager down here. Okay, so no includes, because I'm going to actually define what shows up there elsewhere with fragments. Does that make sense? So that's the general way that you're going to set up that layout. Is you need the toolbar, and then the tab layout, and then the view pager. You'll also see that I have two additional layouts here. So I've got fragment tab 1, which is pretty simple. It's just a text view that says tab 1. I have another text view here, tab 2. Right? So those are my two layouts for the actual fragments or the tabs. Make sense? So you have one layout for each tab, potentially, under the assumption that they're actually containing different content. Right? So that's how I would set that up. I'm going to have one layout for the root and then one layout for each tab. Okay, and these tabs can have anything you want in them because they're just a constraint layout at the root. Okay, let's go to the code now. So let's look at main activity. You'll see that I've got some other classes in here. So I've got a pager adapter class that's been customized, as well as I have a class for each of my tabs. Okay, so my main activity, I need to grab the three controls that I'm going to use. So I'm going to grab make a space for my toolbar and my tab layout and my view pager because I need to use those for a few different reasons. Grab all those widgets just by their ID, hook up the action bar, and then start hooking up the actual tabs. So to hook up, to actually add tabs to the tab layout, which by default starts with no tabs in it, I need to say add tab, And inside there I'm saying new tab, set the text. Right, so here's where I'm actually adding tab 1 and tab 2. If I didn't have those lines in there, there wouldn't be any tabs. And then I'm also setting gravity to fill, which means that those two tabs are going to expand to take up all the available space. Right, so they're going to take up, because I've got two tabs, they're going to take up, each of those tabs are going to take up half. If I set it to, if I had three tabs, they'd be a third of the screen. I could also, if I wanted those tabs to be centered instead of filled, I could easily just come in here and say gravity center or gravity left, etc. So if I wanted them to just be centered, I could do center, but I'm going to do fill here. Does that make sense? So that's how we actually set up the tab layout. Okay. Now that just puts strings in there, right? So tab 0 is tab 1, tab 2, and then the second tab says tab 2. Okay. That doesn't actually get any text or anything to show up on screen. That just puts the tabs there. Okay. The next thing I need to do is actually create the pager adapter object. Okay, so the pager adapter, you see I've called it my pager adapter. You can call it whatever you want, but I've had to create a subclass of the pager adapter. Make sense? This is my custom subclass. So my custom subclass, I need to give it this fragment manager. Whatever pager adapter you create, you will always need a fragment adapter. But that's really all you need to pass into it, is the fragment adapter. Okay, so once we create that adapter, hooking it up to the view pager is pretty simple. I just say view pager, here's the adapter. Does that make sense? So that's all it needs to be able to actually page through.
So why do you need to make a subclass again?
Because pager adapter is abstract.
Oh.
Pager adapter is abstract. So I need to absolutely implement that implement the abstract methods.
Okay.
I'll show you that in a minute. It's really just, I think you were looking at that yesterday, but it's really just two methods. But it's because pager adapter is abstract. So that hook, so now we have the tabs, and now we have the pager. But if I were to, let's say, let me run it without this code here. Okay, so I have tab 1 and tab 2. But notice when I click the tabs, nothing happens, right? Nothing happens. If I can swipe left or right, but notice it doesn't change what tab is selected, right? So initially, these are not connected, right? The tab layout and the view pager are not connected to each other. Okay, so we actually need to connect them so they're synchronized. Okay, we need to put that connection in both directions. So that's what we're doing next, is we're synchronizing so that when one of them changes, the other also changes. So first to the tab layout, I'm going to add a listener there. So I say create a new on tab selected listener. So if you select a new tab, we're going to say view pager, go to that tab. Then view pager, set current, get the position. So if it's tab 0, now it's tab 0 in the pager, or page 0 in there, yeah. So that's what I'm doing. So if you click a new tab, it'll switch over. Or if, and then going the other direction, if I swipe left and right, I need the tab layout to update. So I say take the view pager and add a listener on there. So this will say when you swipe left or right, it will change which tab is selected. Does that make sense? So that's what all that logic is about. And this logic doesn't change. Regardless of how you're setting the view pager up, we'll need both of those connections. So that's basically, that all there is just boilerplate. So let's go to the interesting part now, the page adapter. Okay, there's a lot of different ways to set up a page adapter. So it really depends on your sort of problem, what kind of tabs, what kind of things are you trying to show. So at the moment, I'm just making a very simple layout that always has 2 tabs. Okay? So my pager adapter, you see it implements, it extends fragment pager adapter, again, because I only have a very small number of fixed pages, right? If I have a list of pages in here, then I want to use the fragment state page adapter. So I grab I say the fragment manager. Actually, I don't think I need that. I probably don't need that variable. But I'm taking in the fragment manager, and I'm passing it down into the base class because it needs that. Okay, which is why your constructors will always need that fragment manager, is because the base class, the base fragment pager adapter or the fragment state pager adapter, both of those require a fragment manager. Okay. So we're going to grab that. Then there's only two methods I've got to implement to override that abstract class. So the first one is get count. And here I'm just saying return true, because this one always has 2 tabs. Right? If I had 4 tabs, I just say return 4. Right? So you need to tell it, you need to know how many tabs are there, or how many pages really, how many pages are there. So there's always 2. And then when you say, okay, I want page 0, page 1, page 3, you have to implement that method to say, okay, here's your fragment for that page. Okay? So here it's really simple, it's just a switch statement. So I say switch on the position. If it's 0, the first tab, then we're going to create a new tab 1 fragment. If it's 2, 1, then I'll create the second tab. Okay? And if it's anything else, because I told them there's only 2 tabs, they throw an index out of bounds. Does that make sense? So for a fixed number of tabs, that's how you would set that up. If I had a list of tabs, then I would pass that in probably here. I'd say return the count, and then this would actually be based on that list. Right? I'd say create a new fragment and use the data in that list. Does that make sense? But this is the simple version of, hey, I know exactly I always have 2 tabs. You see how you would easily extend that to, say, 3 or 4 tabs? Okay. If I wanted the same tab in both cases, I could just say return tab 1 fragment in both of these 2 cases. Okay. So that's my pager adapter, which you can see it's pretty simple. It's really just 2 methods that you have to override, plus the constructor. And then here's my fragments. These are probably the simplest fragments you can come up with. So as previously, they extend the fragment base class instead of the activity base class. I've implemented OnCreate. OnCreate doesn't actually do anything because I don't need to do anything at that point. But I want to do something when I do need to actually inflate the layout. So in OnCreate view, I'm inflating with the fragment tab 1. So I'm inflating that layout and returning it. Versus in tab 2, the only thing that changes is I'm inflating the fragment 2 layout. That makes sense? So you kind of get your basic structure there. So anything that you needed to add in for, let's say, setting up initial values, adding the additional controls, or adding listeners, you all do that in here. Same way you would do it with an OnCreate print activity. Does that make sense? You kind of, I can hope that you've got enough there to kind of understand how you set up a tab, set of tabs.
So would you put anything in OnCreate?
Here I need to, right? And in a lot of cases, you may not need to. You saw what we did with the master flow. right? So you can kind of look at that just to see what you might want to put in OnCreate. So you might look at the, say, arguments, right? So if you have something where you're using the same fragment for all of those tabs, which would make sense for like the news app, right? All three of those lists of headlines are basically the same. So I might pass in an argument either to the constructor of the tab or as an argument to say, here's the topic that I want you to show. Does that make sense? So in that case, I would extract the topic in either the constructor for the fragment or the OnCreate method. Does that make sense?
So like data retrieval.
Yeah.
Data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or if I needed to break the box and set the title of like the action bar, I might do that there in OnCreate. Questions? So that's how you basically set up lateral navigation. Is you're going to use a combination of view pagers and the tab layout. Okay. And you use, as you kind of maybe have seen in there, you can actually use the view pager without the tab layout. Okay. The tab layout just gives the user an indication of which tab they're on. But if I was writing a news app, I could say, for instance, down at that lowest level where you're looking at stories, I could say, well, let's not have a tab layout, but let's have the view pager so you can swipe left or right to go through stories. But maybe we don't need to indicate which story you're going. Does that make sense? So the view pager is really the more important part. The tab layout is really just an indication of where you are and a way to go to another tab. Okay, and then there's a bunch of links to these. This top link that they have in there, Navigation Design Guide, is actually to some more advanced sort of navigation stuff that's newer, which we didn't actually talk about. That you can kind of look in here. There's an article about working with navigation drawers. There's another one here about working with tabs. So if you want to find out more about the navigation drawer or the tab layout, those are two good articles to look at. Questions? So we talked about how to navigate up and down and backwards, and you've seen the navigation drawer is the big new thing, the navigation drawer, and the tab layout, the view pager, those are kind of the new pieces. But as you saw in there, an important aspect of working with all of those is you really have to understand how that toolbar works, right? Because that toolbar plays into all three of those things. Okay, so I'll let you get going with the 4-4 laps. Let's take a quick break and come back at 3:35.